can have a debate about integration, and we can absolutely acknowledge the problems where there may be some towns or cities with communities that are not integrating properly. And I think we do have to address that, and we have to be alive to it. But the trouble is, when someone like Jim Ratcliffe just baldly states that we are being colonised, he's playing to a trope. He's actually shutting down the debate that he would want to have, because people like me, who would like a nuanced debate, are forced into another corner where, you know, we could be interpreted as saying there are absolutely no problems with immigration.
Should we start with Jim Ratcliffe? Because Ayesha, I'm very struck by, we started this morning at 6 o'clock, and so many of our listeners have an opinion on Jim Ratcliffe, and it kind of splits into two. I think one is he's a hypocrite, he got his numbers wrong, he lives in Monaco, he's colonising Monaco, what right does he possibly have to discuss anything in Britain? And I would say the majority, though, saying we can have a debate about colonising, but too few people in terms of government talk about integration. He's making a valid point that mass migration has caused an integration problem, and he should be listened to rather than criticised.
So I'm my first thought on this was, how is it possible to be so rich, live in Monaco, and be this unhappy? That was like my first kind of that was just my first thought. If I had that much money and I was like sort of just wafting around Monaco, I'd just be like quite happy with my life, basically. It's not like he's living in, you know, a part of the country which is struggling, and I do accept that there are parts of the country which are really struggling. I think that was just like my sort of first thought, and he didn't really have, like, if he'd been like, you know, where I live right now, I can really see because there are pressures, right? And there is a really important conversation to have about integration and all of that, but we don't really have that sensible, interesting, honest conversation. It is normally one side or the other coming up with some sort of, you know, you've either got the kind of open borders people saying that everybody who raises a concern is really racist, and everybody is like lovely who comes here, and everybody should be allowed to come here. Yeah. Or you have people like him who use really over the top kind of Game of Thrones. Like, he does actually look like a baddie from Game of Thrones, to be honest. He is actually quite a terrifying looking person. You know, the colonising thing. You know, actually there's a really interesting, rich, nuanced conversation to have about integration, the stuff that isn't working and the stuff that is working. You look at people like my parents' generation who came over and have, you know, a beautiful story of integration and have great friendship and kinship with people who were really nice to them when they first came to this country, and they're incredibly well integrated people. And there are problems with integration, but we're not in that space. It's either the kind of, hey, let's be really kumbaya and not acknowledge the problems, or it's people like Jim Ratcliffe saying, I don't live here, but it's all been invaded. You know, we're not having a sensible conversation. Also, immigration is coming down. Yes, small boats are a problem, but actually legal immigration is getting to the point where in a year or so's time, we might be having a conversation about net zero legal migration. We might be having to have a conversation about raising taxes to fill that gap.
Andy Burnham's commented, by the way, which I'll just read to you. And you know, Keir Starmer has commented for political reasons, it strikes me as well. This is at Burnham's. I won't read all of them. It's quite a long speech. But the first bit is, these comments go against everything for which Manchester has traditionally stood, a place where people of all races, faiths and none have pulled together over centuries to build our city and our institutions, including Manchester United Football Club. Calling for curbs on levels of immigration is one thing. Portraying those who come here as a hostile invading force is quite another. It is inaccurate, insulting, inflammatory, and should be withdrawn, says Andy Burnham.
He also goes on to talk about footballers who've arrived here from all over the world to play in Greater Manchester have enhanced the life of our city region, which is, some people are suggesting that Jim Ratcliffe is being a hypocrite for making these remarks and being in the position that he is.
And football is one good example of integration probably working, I think many people would say. Ed, I guess the point is there'll also be people who live in the Greater Manchester area or in the north of England where they say there are parts of the country, people mention Bradford, they mention Blackburn, they mention other places like that, where monocultures exist, and monocultures exist in an unhealthy fashion with people who don't speak the language, who are not able for whatever reason to integrate and espouse a set of views that are alien to the culture to which they've joined, or rather not joined. And Andy Burnham might not want to talk about it, but Jim Ratcliffe is at least speaking a little bit in the direction that many people do want to talk about.
Well, obviously, there's an important principle which I should acknowledge, which is, I was going to start by saying billionaires should just stick to their knitting And, Jim Ratcliffe should run an oil and gas refinery company and not do anything else, because his running of Manchester United has not been very successful. And I obviously disagree with his views. But then it occurred to me, obviously, that if Jim Ratcliffe had given an interview where he said that Brexit was an unmitigated disaster and we should rejoin the European Union, I would be cheering him on. So I better row back and acknowledge that billionaires are allowed to have opinions. But I do disagree with him. And I think that when these bold statements are made, and I chuckled so much with what Ayesha said about unhappy billionaires, that cheers me and I'm sure many other people up a lot. But, he does live this incredibly gilded life in Monaco, and the people who opine, including the sort of MAGA people in America, don't know Britain, don't come to Britain. Jim Ratcliffe's probably been normal probably 20 years ago, and hasn't been on the metro or the tube or a bus for many, many years. And we forget, Sajid Javid recently published his memoir, and he was kind of misquoted as saying he wouldn't want his parents to be admitted now. That was wrong. What he said was that we are probably one of the leading countries in the world when it comes to integration and creating a multicultural society. And Aisha's right to say there are problems, and there are some issues which we do need to address. But, as an MP, I was regularly invited to citizenship ceremonies, which the last Labour government introduced, and they were very moving occasions. And we should remember all those points that people make endlessly. A lot of our public services depend on immigration. A lot of people who take British citizenship once they've been here for a few years are they're not more British than I am, but they've made a conscious effort to change their country and to become the citizen of another country. And, in the old days in America, a country built on immigration, it was a great moment when people got an American passport.
But that's because they've integrated. Ed, I think that's the point.
Absolutely.
But that's because they've integrated.
So we can have a debate about integration, and we can absolutely acknowledge the problems where there may be some towns or cities with communities that are not integrating properly. And I think we do have to address that, and we have to be alive to it. But the trouble is, when someone like Jim Ratcliffe just baldly states that we are being colonised, he's playing to a trope. He's actually shutting down the debate that he would want to have, because people like me, who would like a nuanced debate, are forced into another corner where, we could be interpreted as saying there are absolutely no problems with immigration. That's not my view. I totally have always accepted we should have controlled immigration in order that the public accept it, and I absolutely think we should stop the boats, to coin a phrase. That's something that the public are quite rightly outraged by. But what Jim Ratcliffe said was unnuanced, crude, and untrue.
And just before we move off this, it strikes me, Ayesha, that a year ago, I think Keir Starmer's response to this would have been, I don't agree with the turn of phrase, but there's an important point here, and people who are concerned about the issues in their country should be listened to. And now he sounds more like Andy Burnham. I just wonder whether there's a change at the heart of how Keir Starmer's even responding to this.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, because last year or 18 months ago, we had the Island of Strangers speech, and then he rode back from that, and is now much more full-throated about, he's kicked back against this. He's been much more aggressive with some of the rhetoric from Nigel Farage as well. I just think the reality is people just want, nobody is saying, well, some people are saying don't talk about immigration, but most sensible, good-minded, clever, good but savvy, street-smart people are not saying don't have a conversation about immigration or integration, but they're saying have a common sense, have a sensible conversation about it. And I always think that when people like that say really explosive words like colonise, I would like to have seen him interrogated a little bit more in terms of what does he actually mean by that? Because I do agree with Ed. It sounds like he's got a picture in his head, and he's sort of using some sort of scripted right-wing talking points that you might have seen on social media that have gone into his head. What does that actually mean? If you look at someone like Sundar Katwala, who does a lot of tracking of where British society is, actually you can make an argument we are becoming quite a happily if you look at sort of mixed race relationships and marriages and families and things that is a big growing part of Britain, and it has been for a long time, which would say actually we are blending literally as people. We are not sort of having, yes, there are some issues with integration, but there's a lot of quite happy stories. But it's very unhappy. It's very unfashionable now to talk about like good, happy stories of people coming together from different backgrounds, or people being happy neighbours, or people being friends across different backgrounds. That is incredibly unfashionable. What is very fashionable is just to say that everyone's having a helter-skelter race war right now.
I think it's also, Ayesha, I think what's reflected from our listeners' opinions this morning is there is a real difference depending on where you live in the country, and maybe even what kind of lifestyle, what kind of job, what your experience is of this issue, because lots and lots of people, I have to say, firmly disagree and are saying, oh, come to Bolton, come to Leicester, come to where I live and you'll feel very differently about it. I think there is a sense that people experience this question differently depending on where they live in the country and maybe how they feel about their local area. And I think you're right, Ayesha. I think, generally speaking, people are much better at accepting and welcoming and making friends of people of different cultures and people who've come from different countries. But there are definitely areas of the country where that is not the case. And maybe that's what Jim Ratcliffe is referencing here.
Listen, Kate, I agree with everything you're saying, but I will bet my life on this. Jim Ratcliffe living as a billionaire in Monaco does not have a grip on what's going on in somewhere like Bolton right now.
Well, and that may be.
I'm really sorry.
I mean, that may be the case. I suppose there are people, though, who are also saying, Ayesha, does it really matter where he comes from? Does it matter that he's wealthy? Does it matter where he lives? If he's saying something that actually people in these areas are saying. I mean, Elizabeth, for example, said, this is to you, Ed, come up north to the old mill towns of Yorkshire. If you're white, you're made to feel not very welcome. I went to Keighley to buy a car. I was made to feel as though I shouldn't be driving a car, never mind buying one for myself. Come up and experience what it's like in those areas of the country where this does feel like a problem for some people.
Yeah, and we all know what we're talking about there, and we all know that is an issue that people are concerned about. I guess what drives me mad is that Jim Ratcliffe is doing a kind of sub Elon Musk, and Elon Musk kind of throwing these stones into the pond from wherever he currently lives, Silicon Valley or Texas or wherever, describing a Britain that is not real. And I absolutely accept the point that Elizabeth is making. But, this idea that, parts of London are governed by Sharia law, or that London is now a lawless city, is absolutely ludicrous. And a lot of people have made the point that one of the reasons that kind of the MAGA crowd kind of fear this is because London works as a multicultural city. London is the greatest.
But what about not London,
city
Ed? What about outside London?
Absolutely, and Ayesha's already referred to that. There are some towns and cities where integration is a real problem. But you should never forget that immigration over 300 years has been potentially a politically toxic issue, and when immigrant communities come to a particular country, they often form their own communities as they begin the process of integration. And let's see what it would look like in a second or third generation of immigrants. Sajid Javid made the point again in his memoir that his mother didn't speak English. She speaks English now. People take time to integrate, but people come to this country and they do a job of work for us, which we need. And if they left tomorrow, I mean, we've even been talking in the last few weeks, if we get to a position of net zero immigration, the huge impact it could potentially have on our economy. So it needs to be balanced. And I just don't like this idea of billionaires living a privileged life, not experiencing how people in the UK live their lives, coming out with a blanket statement, which effectively says this country has been colonised, and we all know where that goes and what impact that has when people like that make statements like this.